So you'll, so here we go. And welcome everybody. And so I will hand my, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves. And while Pleasance is going to do a, I don't know, how long did you say, 20-minute presentation, whatever it is. And then people can ask questions after Pleasance's presentation. Our colleague Dixcy Bosley is here, who's a nurse care manager at Iona, and Deshawn Larimore is also here, who it works with me at Around Town DC. And many of you, she's at the beach where we all want to be. Okay, so all righty, then I'll mute myself, and Deshawn will, Pleasance will proceed. So thank you, Pleasance.
Thanks for having me. If you would do me a favor and not put anything in the chat while I'm presenting, because I won't see it, and or Dixcy will hold it, or Deshawn, someone just notify. Feel free to also just say, raise your hand, unmute, and ask a question. We'll have time for that at the end, but if something comes up. So here we go. I'm Pleasance Silicki from Iona. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator. And today I am presenting about what is a death doula, and tell you a little bit. Let me start with myself. So who am I? I'm Pleasance Silicki. I live in Tenleytown, live right down the street from Iona. I've been volunteering with Iona for about 8 years. But my background is in holistic health and wellness around from a Vedic, yogic, and Buddhist perspective. And I've been teaching stress management and race and community relations at American University for the past 5 years as a professor. I have been in birth work and in life coaching as part of the holistic health model. And that is what actually led me to death and grief work, is that I've always been interested in death and grief, and done a lot of studies about it and taken classes and things like that. But it really was after working with people for so many years, realizing that the death work was the foundation for the normalizing grief, normalizing emotions, really noticing the death phobic culture that we're living in and wanting to shift awareness to more death positive. Join Death Positive DC. I really believe in honoring transitions and portals and thresholds in life and transforming how we live. I'm in the process of being ordained in my heritage, which is Jewish feminist earth-based practices. And that has also played into my decision to start chaplaincy in the fall and work more. I did the death doula training with Inelda about 4 years ago. So I have a very, very close relationship with my grandmother. She raised me, and this is something we've talked about for many years, and always we're visiting sick and aging adults in our community in Connecticut. And then very recently, my grandmother just transitioned. So I actually had an opportunity to be with her at her end of life and talk to her about it the past few years, which was very powerful. So what is a doula? Who knows? Anyone want to unmute? I'll give you the definitions. Here we go. So a doula is a trained companion who's not a healthcare professional, who supports another person through significant health-related experiences. But something that's really interesting is that doula is a Greek word, which the meaning of the word doula is a non-medical person who gives spiritual, physical, emotional support to somebody else. And this word, this Greek word doula, has been now transferred into our culture to really assist both birth and death transitions. And so I think that's really just a beautiful kind of history and background. And like I said, I actually got started in birth work and did a lot of birth support and prenatal yoga support and health support, stress support for pregnancy and birth related spiritual, emotional, and mental support, and realized death has a very similar, there's a similar angle of care. And so wanted to include that more in the services. All right, so I'm going to show this video. Dixcy, I can see you. Will you give me a thumbs up and just make sure you can hear it when I play it? Thank you. Oops.
Started farming when I was 10, my first job, and fell in love with it.
Molly Nelson lives on her farm in Cornish.
Spent a lot of time in the woods. So that's my number one thing, is spending time in the woods. Hi, puppy dogs. I'm just super fascinated with animal behavior and any kind of behavior, even plant behavior. Just, I love observing. I've always been an observer.
Death abounds in nature, and in her own life, it's been close by.
I've always known that death is like right there. I guess because when I was born with a pretty serious coart in my aorta, a very narrow, thin section right where the curve is. I've always been told I could blow at any moment, which is kind of rowdy.
For the last several years, Molly has helped guide 13 people through the end of their life as a certified death doula.
It's like the most rewarding, fascinating, it sounds like a downer, but it's like a total upper.
She helps people get their ducks in line, as she calls it, helping them with wills, planning their own services, and deciding what they want their end-of-life care to look like.
We have to have the will done, and let's start a legacy project where, you know, maybe you want to give some of your land to the Nature Conservancy, or maybe you wanted to make a cookbook with the kids, or, you know, just get it all going on. So that they're just like, oh yeah, I got a hold, or maybe you want to clean out all your crap so your kids don't end up with it, which is what my mom did, which was epic. I mean, she got rid of everything. When she died, we were like, whoo, even the storage unit that we had the key to, we opened it up and there wasn't anything in it. And we're like, yeah, you know, that's a gift.
One client Molly worked with for several years before he died at the age of 99.
It became apparent that he wanted to have a celebration before he died. He wanted to basically be at his funeral. And he called it graduating. So then between the two of us, we came up with the fact, let's have a graduation party. And it was epic. It was just the best. He had one of those little hats with a tassel, and all the neighbors coming by, and stories were told, and food. He says, let's have a big bowl and put a bunch of questions in there that will trigger conversations about death. And there was a lot of people there that had never met each other before at his graduation party. And his wish was for, he said, you know, I would like everyone here to pick a buddy that you've never met before and take a couple of these questions out of the bowl and go for a little stroll around the farm and talk about it. And those guys went for 3.5 hours. They didn't want to quit. It was amazing. So that kind of magic can happen.
But she kind of has a way of getting in, delving in without offending you, without being personal and invading your personal space in a way, but drawing things out of you. She's just so good at it. And she's very honest and open. I mean, she just says it like it is in a kind way. And you got to think about this, and you got to do this. And she gives you notes, and she gives you steps, and she gives you homework to do.
Kathy Minardi has been working with Molly for the last several years.
I have thyroid cancer that metastasized to my one hip, my lungs. The good thing about having a death doula, she's an outside person, and she can discuss it with you without the emotions of talking about it with your child. Your child or your close people are not always comfortable having those discussions, but for she is, because that's what she does, and she's wonderful at it.
Whether you're the person dying or the person who has a loved one that's dying, you know, there's so much denial, I guess, in our culture. And that's such a bummer because you're missing out on some rich stuff.
Kathy says she feels she has an advantage in knowing she can plan for death.
And that's something I think she helps with, just having you let go. You know, what do you want to continue to do? And what memories do you want to make? And what do you have to give up? I feel like I'm going to be able to deal with it pretty well, but you never know till you're there.
Molly has been present for 5 of her clients' actual deaths, an experience she considers an honor.
Beauty and all the emotions you could ever imagine. Celebrating, people totally losing it, everything. Anger, it goes all over the place. And nothing's wrong, nothing's bad. And it's also really nice to help people understand that none of that is bad. They're living life exactly as it should be.
Molly works to prepare the families of her clients as well, and she makes sure to check her own beliefs of death and afterlife at the door, letting her clients' belief systems be the guide.
I guess at this point in my life, death doesn't scare me, but it's sad because there's things, you're not going to watch your grandson do this or your son and wife do that. So, there's a sadness to it, but you just try and making memories we talk about a lot, and just make as many memories as you can while you're able to.
She may be called a death doula, but Molly Nelson is really a guide, helping people find their way from this life, not without pain or sadness, but hopefully with acceptance.
Don't rob yourself of the experience of how beautiful and amazing it can be. Don't rob yourself of all the emotions that come up. It's, like I say, it's one of the most magical times of life. It's one of the biggest things that happens to us.
Now, Molly Nelson is one of 2 death doulas in Maine that are certified by the...
Okay, I just want to pause. Just kind of let that sink in for a second. That beautiful story. Dixie, is there anything in the chat or any questions or anything I need to address at this moment? Are we good?
No, not right now.
Thanks. So as death professionals, as death doulas, and also I want everyone to be mindful that sometimes we're called end of life doulas because death can be very activating. Even the word can bring up so many fearful emotions. So just know that we kind of use interchangeably death doula and end of life doula. So how are some ways that we might support the dying and their loved ones? Sometimes I'm hired by the family. Sometimes I'm hired by the person who is dying. It really depends. There's a huge spectrum. Sometimes I just consult with a family who has a family member who is perhaps in hospice or who's just been given a diagnosis. And so they don't want long-term care, but they just need some help grounding ideas for legacy projects. For example, those photo books or music playlists, videos. There's lots of really interesting creative. The legacy projects tend to be quite creative that families can come up with. Help with supporting caregivers or patients, dying adults, help with household or admin tasks, sometimes just running errands or just taking care of things that need to be taken care of. A supportive companion with no agenda. So that's a really important aspect of death doula support, is not having an agenda, no judgment, but just having a supportive companion and witness. Making connections, referrals, and brainstorming ideas. So because most death professionals, death doulas and end-of-life care doulas, in my experience, in my training, and then in the kind of real world, we all have really different backgrounds. And so we have different referral networks and different ideas and brainstorming ideas for legacy projects, but also we're part of, again, in my experience, wider networks. For example, Iona is a neighborhood resource that I've used in the past when I've been working with clients. And so that's what I also really love about the end of life care, end of life doulas, is that our backgrounds are really varied. And so the referral networks are different, and the connections that we make and our histories can be really different. In my end of life doula training, we had hospice nurses, doctors, all sorts of healthcare professionals and social workers, and also artists, musicians, writers, lots of creative fields who feel as if honoring death is really just something to really honor. And doing this work is such a great privilege. And so taking it in consideration for more of a community, spiritual, network type of opportunity. Again, with most of these relationships, there's no hidden agendas or histories because they're not family members. And that can be really refreshing when there's any regrets, family disturbance, and difficulty in any kind of history with relationships, which is very common. And just normalizing some of the commonalities of difficulties in relationship. Some death doulas create rituals and help families and or patients or dying adults create the rituals. And then educating on quote unquote normal and or end of life patterns and phases. So there are some things that you can look for that are patterns that you can educate on, and also knowing that there's a huge spectrum that happens at end of life, and just being a grounded support and companion for families, and in all the ways that are needed, really. I'll pause. Dixcy, is there anything you want to add?
I think you can go on, Pleasance.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So end of life care doula, some of the other kind of practical logistics, funerals, vigils, early grief processing, especially if a family member, a loved one, or a dying loved one is now unconscious, and you're kind of processing the first stages of grief. Normalizing a variety of requests and processing, non-judgmental, non-denominational companion, witness with emotional and practical support. So what's the difference between hospice and death doulas? And this is where I'd love for Dixcy also to please chime in. But one of the ways that we can kind of talk about the differences, this is one of the main questions that we get, is hospice is a wide and deep medical consulting service. There's a lot of holistic benefits included in hospice, and lots of wonderful webs of referrals. Also, hospice can be and is affiliated with Medicare, but death doulas and end of life care are usually individuals pay out of pocket. Oftentimes, death doulas and end of life doulas are volunteers, sometimes within a unit or within a hospice or within a community, within a congregation. So it kind of depends on the community setup and the care setup. But death doulas are going to support the hospice program, the health program that's in place, not create one. So they will be able to help support the plans and reinforce it. They also, another thing that I've done is be the communication between the hospice and the family. Sometimes things change physically as we're moving through death phases, end of life phases, and we can communicate with hospice, oh, this has changed today, and just being able to be a middle person of support. Dixcy, anything else to add to that feels important?
No, you've done a great job explaining it. I'm loving. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I love hearing that. I love hearing the different perspectives describe hospice, because I think everyone has different impressions of hospice. So it's important to just keep the conversation open and describing it, because perceptions matter, and they inform actions. So anyway, thanks for carry on. Great job.
So one other aspect that comes up is that occasionally, sometimes the family has more of a lens where they want to have more of a spiritual, sacred aspect. And sometimes it's the dying person who says, I really feel a spiritual transition, but I'm not comfortable talking to my family about it because for whatever reason. And so I like to name this because it's very common in death doula communities and conversations that there is something spiritual happening. And so again, when we're thinking about companions and witness and non-judgmental and non-denominational, that there can be a spiritual aspect for any of the members, any of the families involved, any of the participants involved, and that we sort of in my training, we acknowledge this sacred mystery of the portal and threshold of birth and death. And so we don't inject beliefs or thoughts into our relationship, but there is space for spiritual, sacred, mysterious aspects of these portals of life and death. All right, so some questions I'm going to stop sharing and let us kind of have a little bit of a discussion. Let's start with, would you consider hiring a death doula for yourself or a loved one? Is this something you might want support with in your transition, and or is it something you'd like your family to have, or you'd want to hire, for example, if you're someone in your family was going through this? And then why or why not? And what are some of the pros and cons that you see to this? So those are just the resources at the end. Okay, so let me stop sharing so I can see you all. Awesome. Yes. Hoff, is that how I pronounce your name?
Yes, I'm definitely on the road to a death doula. I love the profession. I've never met a death doula that I didn't think was fabulous. And so I appreciate the whole profession. And certainly I'll look for that for support on my transition. I'm considering a home death, home funeral, home death. And I'm wondering, is that require a doula with special training? Are all doulas going to be able to help with that? Are you that kind of person? What do you have on that?
Yeah, I love this question. It's something we talk about a lot in death positive culture, because when we go upstream and try to identify how we got here to so much fear, phobia, we really go back to naming this idea that the natural cycles of birth and death have been removed from the home. Right. And so in history, 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, birth and death was happening at home. Fun fact, the living room is named the living room because it's where the living members would come and be together, because the deceased would be in the other room. And so the living would meet in one room and we would wash the body in the other room. Right. So a lot of death doulas that I'm in relationship with and have conversations about, our dream is to return to more natural home deaths, home funerals. There's a lot in regenerative recomposition. There's just a lot of really natural rhythms that we are trained in. There's no special training that, in my experience, where it's separate. What we are trained to do is, if we are in a hospice or a hospital setting or working under an umbrella of a medical system like that, to really listen and learn to what their protocols are. But when we're at home, we get to really work with the family, the dying human. We really get an opportunity to be more in natural relationship and just relax into this beautiful transition, and really seeing it much more in a positive, not like happy culture way, but a much more natural, authentic way of moving through the life cycle. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm just wondering about the logistics required that might might require more extra training. I know you don't do medical stuff,
Right.
but to die at home and to have a home funeral, so to speak, requires, I think, a little extra expertise. So I think what you're saying is that there's not extra training for it, but some people have more experience than others.
And I would say it depends. Like it depends is the answer a lot of times, because we want to work with the individual and the family. So we would work. So for example, I would say, okay, let's make a list of who our supports are. Where are we missing? What might we need? Who do we need to call? Who's your healthcare physician? If that's in play, we'd want to really get the map of the support team. This model is also very much, we have this in birth and in death, built upon layers of support. And so we would never want anybody to not have multiple layers of support in any role in the dying process. So not only is are we supporting the person who's transitioning, but then also I would have supervision and support, right? So if I was coming, I would be calling on my layers of support. So it really depends, health conditions, diagnosis, where you live, what your other supports are, if there's hospice in place. So we'd want to kind of go, those are some of the questions I would ask if someone were to call and ask about that.
Thank you.
And a lot of dry ice, I think. I understand you need a lot of dry ice. So we did have somebody talk about this, having a home funeral, and that seemed to be one of the primary things that you need.
And again, this is where the doula's role is to say, what do you want, family and or person transitioning, like who's ever the main, one of the things that we really talk about is like, who is asking for the support? Because we really believe in consent. We really believe in boundaries. And so it's really important if Dixcy is hiring Pleasance and Dixcy has a terminal diagnosis and is dying, then I am saying, Dixcy, what do you want? How can I support your wishes? How can I support your transition? And then Dixcy communicates with me, we negotiate, have that conversation. So, and then the doula again is that kind of middle person who's saying, okay, great, now let me go meet with this expert and or hire this person for you, and or what other layers of support do you need? Sometimes death doulas are hired just to create legacy projects because people in the family don't want to talk about death. And so someone may just be like, I know this is going to happen. It's the one thing we all have in common. I'd love to have a playlist of all my favorite music, or I'd love to finally get that scrapbook done, or, hi, death doula, person who's very happy to talk about death. Can we talk about some of my regrets? That happens a lot, or forgiveness, because sometimes perhaps the person that you need to forgive has already transitioned. So a death doula can also just be a really active listener.
One person asked if you helped anyone who died at home with the wish to have their body donated to a medical facility for study.
I have not. I'm sure that some of my colleagues have, and I'm happy to reach out to them, and or Dixcy might have resources.
Yeah, so one of the programs that we did both for the End of Life Expo as well as in this last group of series on Zoom is we had folks come and speak from the armed forces. What's it called, Nina?
I don't remember, but
Ronald, who came.
There's
There's GW, Howard University, Georgetown University, and the Armed Forces Medical that
USIS.
no, USIF, that's right. Uniform Services, that's what it's called, Uniform Services. And they all have an application process where you can, indicate that you are interested in donating your body. I believe some of them, like Georgetown, is a little bit harder to get into because they give you back your direct remains after the autopsy, after the students use it. But other places don't. So there might be a waiting list at Georgetown, but we live in a city with a lot of teaching hospitals. So if you're interested in body donation, you should look into that. And we have some resources, so you can contact us at Iona as well. I just wanted to add one more thing to what Pleasance said about the doula accompaniment role is, I just know that when I was a labor and delivery nurse, when families hired a doula, and we worked with midwives, it just was like another layer of comfort for the couple, because they may not fully trust that the medical folks are going to implement their wishes. So the doula becomes the advocate, the experienced advocate and comforter who's really on their side to make sure that the birth plan is implemented, and to like be a coach. And it's a beautiful experience when a family hires a doula. And that said, it's also a luxury that a lot of people can't afford. So there is some health disparities there that we need to address. And I think the same thing happens with death doulas, that it's a paid fee for service, that there's a disparity. And I think we need to figure out ways that maybe there could be pro bono doulas, because we need that service. As a hospice nurse, we need doulas in the home.
I thank you so much for saying that. In my experience, definitely on the birth side, they're a much higher cost and much more prevalent. Most of the doulas in my training, there was 100 people in my training, and they are running INELDA trainings now, like every month, basically, because people are becoming more aware of death culture and wanting to be more actively involved, are much more likely to have volunteer services, again, at your hospital, your hospice, your congregation. I know the death positive DC, there's many of us in there, and we donate services and time. So that's really interesting. It's so interesting to me that you brought that up. I've never really thought about it in terms of the birth world is quite expensive and exclusive. And in my experience, the death world has been much more accessible, and yet still not really known about. People, when I say, oh, I do death doula work as well, people say, what is that? And they kind of hide and, run away as fast as possible. Right. So we're working on death awareness, death positive awareness, and having real authentic conversations about this, but the disparities are real.
So is it a fee for service? Like, are you saying that if they went to the organization, they could find like maybe a sliding scale?
Yeah, that's what I noticed, is that there is much more space, accessibility financially. Like even the video we watched, I think she said there's only 2 death doulas in Maine at the time. It's a few years old, but still, I think in my experience, I've seen it really depends, but I've been around many, many death doulas who offer services on sliding scale and or complimentary, just do it as a support, not as kind of all day, every day, full-time work per se. Right. And that's really different than birth work, where I don't know a lot of volunteer birth doulas. Yeah. So it really depends. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Oh, Polly, this is a great question. What happens if you're hired by the family, but they are at cross purposes with the person transitioning? That's when you reach out to your beloved end of life care doula support. No. For me, I'll just speak for myself. Whoever makes the call, who's asking for the support, that's who I'm the companion of. So sometimes if the family there's cross purposes, but the family has hired me to support them, I help them with the discomfort of the person transitioning having cross purposes in them. Does that make sense? So it's sitting in the discomfort. Sometimes that's what we're doing. Sometimes I will say, I hear you. I hear how hard this is, that the person you love is X, Y, or Z. And then we sit there in that, and we have that support together.
It can't be easy.
It's not for anyone. And it's a real honor and privilege and gift to sit in human emotion that's just so based in love and care. Margie. Hi, Margie.
Hi, Pleasance. Long time
Great
no
to see
see.
you.
Great to see you. I missed your intro because I'm a postpartum doula and I was coming back from work. But I've always been fascinated with hospice and end of life care, and I loved Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it's so clear that we're so death phobic in this culture, and that's sort of the obvious. But it's interesting because when I tell people I'm a doula, a lot of people don't even know about that.
Right.
I don't think it's even necessarily just socioeconomic, although of course the expense is part of it. But somehow there are some insurances that will pay for postpartum services if the wording is exactly right, and I'm not sure what that is, and hopefully that's something that will enter the death assistance community too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say I have similar, it was before COVID, I realized that I had spent most of my life always interested in hospice, reading these books, Diary of a Death Doula, reading all of Stephen Jenkinson's work. If y'all don't know him, he has a movie on YouTube called Grief Walker that's free. It's fabulous. Oh, grab your tissues because you'll just sit. You know him, Dixcy, Stephen Jenkinson. Oh, whew. Die Wise is his book. It's huge, but he's one of those, those truth tellers where he says things that are quite uncomfortable, but they get you in your gut or your heart, and you're like, wow, that's spot on. The way he talks about the death industry, the way he talks about just, for me, it's quite painful because I really see how far we have come from being able to be with each other in this way. And so Grief Walker talks about his journey, and it's really quite astonishing. So these are the things I was doing for fun on the weekends, was watching Grief Walker, reading Stephen Jenkinson. I read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in high school, took Death and Dying in high school, read memoirs about dying people my whole life. And before COVID, I thought, doesn't everybody, I was asking somebody about it. And I said, didn't you read that book? And they said, what are you talking about? And all of a sudden it was like a light. I said, this is something I want to do in life. And so did the Death Doula INELDA training, and it kind of all the pieces came together. So
that's what call looks like.
Exactly. But it was almost like hit over the head, right? I was like, wait, you all aren't staying up? You haven't done 5 wishes before you're 40? Like, I don't understand. None of my friends know what it is. So it was like, oh, this is what I need to be doing. Okay, cool. There was a question in the chat about how would a doula and the primary care physician relate to their shared role or with hospice? And I would say that they're different, that the primary care physician is really working with the medical symptoms, and is really, that's a whole different talk about, there's a beautiful memoir from a doctor, I can't remember the name of it right now, that talks about how much in her experience in medical school, she was trained to prevent death. And how painful that is for her now, this many years later, to realize how much harm she's caused because she hasn't accepted normal transitions. And so for me, the primary care physician is trained to do whatever they can in medical to prevent death in a lot of cases from medical school training. And again, a doula is just saying, what's here? What do you need? How can I help? In a lot of ways, we're not providing any medical recommendations. And same with hospice. Like if there's a hospice plan in place, the death doula is supporting the hospice plan. What is the cost of death doula support by the hour? Totally depends. Depends where you live. It depends. I imagine in Maine, when there was only 2, the price is probably different. If there's maybe 5 now, I don't know. It really depends on the area. It also, again, depends on if it's coming from hospice. Some hospice have great relationships I've heard about with death doulas. Some have very, very strained, tense relationships in hospitals. Is there a registry? Yes. I'm wondering if I could send maybe the resources or list or something. Well, maybe I can talk to Lena and Dixcy and Deshawn about how to get that to you all. But it really is, if you're, able to Google death doula near me, there are directories in most major cities now. INELDA, the International End of Life Doula Association, which is where I trained, is wonderful resources and lists. I'll just put that acronym in the chat for you. Oh, thank you, Edwina, for putting Grief Walker in. Are death doulas available in this area? Yes. Typical cost totally depends. Death Positive DC has a lot of us who have trained in INELDA. One of the most well-established death doula trainers for INELDA actually lives in DC. And so there's quite a big network of us, and there's just a full range of prices. So I'm also, let me put my Iona email in here. And if you have any specific questions around wanting to be connected with DC death doula resources, or if I can be of support to help you find someone or be of support, just email me. You can reach out to Lena anytime to get my information as well. Any other questions?
I guess another question related to the cost is is it like an hourly thing, or is it like a package? Like,
totally depends.
yeah.
So if someone calls me, so I'll give you, you want to go through an example of what happens?
Yeah, because like death doesn't, just like birth, it doesn't happen on a timeline.
Oh.
And so you might want your death doula there for 48 hours or for last 2 hours, right?
Really depends. So again, you might call and say, I'm interested in doing a legacy project. I don't have a terminal illness, but I want to do this. So we say, okay, we could do a 1 of or 2 hours or something like that. You might have someone who says, for example, I had a family call me. The mom did not want support. The daughter was the only person here supporting her. And actually it was during COVID. So it was all online. But the daughter was with her. So she hired me to help support her. And it was like 30, we decided, well, it's a negotiation. What do you need? Here's what I can offer. And if I can't, I refer. But she said at the time the doctor had given her mom 6 months. And I said, how does 30 minutes once a week for a check-in sound like, where you can call me and we can have that? And she said, that would sound great. We got through like, I think 3 months, and her mom was like doing fine. Hadn't really declined. She's like, can we go and pause until it gets closer? I said, absolutely. Like, let's just wait. So then, and then she actually emailed me probably like 3 months later. And she was like, my mom died overnight in her sleep. Right. So like, again, it was like, we had set up, and she said, and I felt strong and capable enough to handle, because we'd already done the pre-grief work in those earlier sessions when she thought it was going to be sooner. And then she said, I'm just really grateful I had that support. And she said, actually, and now that my mom has transitioned, I'm going to leave the area. I'm leaving this town after COVID. So I think that's one of the negotiations in those initial consults. What are you looking for? We don't have a timeline. I read a beautiful memoir of a death doula where she talked about all the differences with the people that she had transitioned with, and some were months and months, and some were a few days, and some had called right at the end, and some had called with months left. So it really depends. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think people who tend to go into this work are okay with that flexibility. We understand that, we honor it. Like, I honor that divine transition in whatever way it unfolds. Mm-hmm. So who am I to be on the divine's timeline? Yeah.
Hospice question here. Is the doula
Yeah.
that she referred to
Yes.
as a major trainer for Inalda Nicole? Oh, okay, or someone else. Okay,
Yes.
all right. Does anybody else have any questions? I thought I saw somebody in the,
Or anybody think they would hire one or be interested or not? I'd love to hear someone who's like, I do not want this support. I just always think it's interesting to have wide, diverse opinions, you know.
As you were going through the questions, my husband passed away 11 years ago. And during that process, I didn't know about doulas, but my church community, my family, my friends were all doulas for me. And they were all volunteer.
What a gift.
But yeah, I was blessed with the people that I found.
What a gift.
Not only during his death, but after his death. And he was a hoarder. So it's like I had to clean out the house. And I found this angel who truly was miraculous. So I consider Bibi my doula.
As you should. That's what that companionship is. How many of us, I'm just curious, have had people we love transition and maybe it didn't go well? Yeah, there's some hands, some nods. So I think some of us have supports in some situations, and what a gift, and honoring them. I invite you, I'm sure you have reached out and said lots of gratitude and appreciation. And I always continue to say, and when we remember, when we kind of name and have an aha, like I had this amazing, you know, I had all these doulas, to revisit that gratitude and appreciation, because one of the things we talk about a lot is like, what is a good death? And what is a difficult or a hard death? And what does that mean? And that's so individual. But it sounds like you had a lot of support, which would lend itself. And do you have a question? Are you raising your hand? No. Oh, I can't hear. You're on mute, Anne. Unmute.
Thank you so much. That's all. I'm enjoying this program tremendously.
My pleasure. There was another question in the chat. If a person has no intention of dying anytime soon, is it appropriate to begin work with a doula that may end up on hold even for years? I just smile because I love this. The person has no intention of dying anytime soon. And today might be my last day. I don't know. So I think one of the reasons that death work brings me a lot of energy and vitality is because I truly honor it as the path of living. And lots of death doulas and I think people in the death profession talk about this angle, that it brings tremendous joy and intentionality and meaning to life when you spend a lot of time talking and working with death. And so for the person who asked this question, is it appropriate to begin work with a doula that may end up? I had a client last year, actually she was pregnant, and she hired me to do death and grief work because she was terrified of dying, and she couldn't really enjoy her pregnancy because she was so afraid of dying. And so I actually used those skills with her. She hired me as a birth support, and we ended up doing death support and writing out a plan for her to kind of reconcile some of the difficulties she was experiencing when we went underneath. What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Why are you so afraid of death? Oh, because I have never had this conversation with my father. Oh, because I feel this way. Oh, okay, well, maybe in the next 6 months, you can have that conversation. And that is part of our grief work, is living our life with the understanding that that intention of not dying anytime soon is not really in our control, is not at all in our control. Is that helpful or answer that question? I hope. Yeah, thanks for those comments. Would you be the person to would you be the person to talk with about coaching people through the aging solo recommendations for those of us hesitant to complete the forms? I think that there are many of us at Iona who could do that, who could sit with you and offer that support for sure. Yeah.
Dixcy, do you want to talk about what you do about that?
Yeah, I'm a nurse care manager at Iona. I come from a long 25 years experience with hospice, and I'm a nurse practitioner. And so I see clients and meet with adult children and spouses around end of life planning and care management. But even if it's not end of life planning, I always insert end of life planning in my consultation. So yeah, I've been part of the aging solo groups, and we talk about care management, but we also talk about how to start doing our documents. And I just want to underscore what Pleasance says about, you know, I think it was Polly who talked about her friends. And I think it's so important when you're picking an advocate, a healthcare proxy, to pick somebody who is comfortable with death, because that's the person who you're asking to advocate for you when you're in a crisis. And it has to be someone who's assertive, who knows what your wishes are, and to know how to really be a conduit between you and your clinicians. And so bravo that you had friends that could be a doula for you. I mean, it's so beautiful. And so you have to choose your advocates wisely. And that's something that we talk about a lot in Aging Solo, because people come to Aging Solo because they're afraid they're not going to have anybody near them when they need them. So you're never alone at Iona.
Yeah.
We are going to have a doctor, I think in October, who's going to talk about some of the questions that you might want to ask your physician or healthcare provider around end of life issues. So that should be an interesting discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's one other question in the chat around, does a doula have any clout in pressing for aid and dying when the person nearing death has documented that's what they want? This might involve interfacing with the person's doctor or family members. This would be something that we would be discussing along the way if there's differences between what the family wants and what the person who is dying wants. And it wouldn't, let me put it this way, it wouldn't like come as a surprise when it happens. We would be able to walk slowly through the difficulties of the differences and really honor them. Like other supportive service-based professions, there are sometimes mistakes, there's difficulty, there's relationships. So I don't want to sugarcoat it and pretend, oh, it's all fine and it always works out. There can be ethical difficulties and challenges. And that's where I go back to that layers of support that I talked about, where I would never put myself in a situation where I wasn't getting support or reaching out to a wider network to make sure that I'm stable while I'm supporting the differences. And sometimes people make mistakes, and or in one of the death doula memoirs I read, she talked at length about one client she had where she ended up having to lie for the person who had died had a baby and put it up for adoption. And the person who was dying really wanted the person to know. And it was very messy and complicated. And there ended up having to be some lying involved. And you could really read from the memoir how much this has been on that particular death doula's mind, heart, brain. Did I make the right decision? Did I not? So that's present. Yeah, or can be.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Anybody else have any last questions? Roseanne, I think you have something you want to say?
Yes, I don't know. Am I muted or unmuted?
You're unmuted. We can hear you.
Okay. So I really have a wish to die in a certain place, but who knows that that could happen. So either at home or up the street in Haagen-Dazs, and I went through what I wanted, you know, really I would be so happy at one of these Iona sessions and on writing your obituary. So I would like to be surrounded by 3 Belgian chocolate ice cream shakes with hot fudge and topped with whipped cream and chocolate sprinkles. I want 3 of them. And I want the last one loaded with morphine or whatever is going to, and do it, because I want to die my way. And I don't really want to be around if I don't feel I could be me, but you have no way of doing that. And no one's going to help you. So I'm having problems with that, because if I were to have dementia or something, I really don't want to be around. I don't want to be a burden to my family. I don't want to be here. And if I can't live the kind of life that's meaningful to me, I don't want to be here. And so I at least want to be happy. And so when I read this during an obit writing class that Iona did for a whole thing on end of life, the whole class laughed. And the instructor said, would you be happy if that were your obituary? And I said, I would be overjoyed. And I think people found that hard to understand. But all I know is that if we are the type of state that has a law, but the best it could do, you have to have 2 doctors testify that you have only 6 months to live. It has nothing to do with quality of life. It has nothing to do with meaningful life. It has nothing to do with anything that's important to me. So even if I had a death doula, I don't imagine they're going to be able to carry out what I want as my legacy.
I hear you.
So what does one?
We're not there yet, right? Dixcy's posting about advocacy that needs to happen during this process. As I've been caring for my own grandmother through her transition, I was bringing my daughter along who's 14, and I said, so if this happens to me, we're going to Europe. I wrote out, I gave her the links. I started talking to her because we're not there yet. We're building death and grief awareness and these systems of support. And we're not in a place where the dying person's wishes and beliefs are sometimes the highest priority, unfortunately. And so I just want to be real about that I think we're not.
So where in Europe are you going to?
Well, there's a whole list of places.
You don't need to go to Europe. You just have to fight for the laws here. In DC, we have the right to die along with 10 other states. We just need to help Maryland pass it and Virginia pass it. And
yeah, but it's not enough.
People are leaving states just like people are leaving different states to have abortions. And, it's our right to take a toxic medication if you want in this state. And so we need to make sure that.
But how do you get it?
You have to be terminally ill. You have to be competent. You have to have 2 doctors.
But that's the issue.
Yeah.
Who says you are terminally ill, which is 6 months to live?
Your primary care doctor.
Yeah, my doctor wouldn't do that.
Well, get a new doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
And I can't say that enough. There are doctors in this town who have patients of mine who have very clear ideas of that they want to do right to die, and their doctors will not write the order. So you need to find a doctor who will write the order.
Yes. Do you have a list of those doctors?
Yes, I do.
Resources?
Yeah.
Great. I want to make sure that we all.
I remember being at a talk that Diane Ream gave, and as you know, she's very active and concerned about this area after having watched her husband stop eating and have a horrible death, because that's really your only choice, to stop eating and have a horrible, horrible death. So she's been writing about this, etc. But even when she talks, she has to say yes, and 2 doctors have to say, because we all know what the DC law is. But yes, I would be interested in having the doctor list.
Yeah, maybe that's
it's not a long list, but contact Compassion and Choices. I've got to jump off because I have a 4 o'clock, but it's nice to see you all and stay in touch.
Thanks, everybody.
So Compassion and Choices has a list.
Yep.
And we did have Compassion and Choices last week, and last month, I think, and I think I put that online. I will add. I have to check and see if I recorded it or not, but I'll add it to this 3rd Thursday page, and I'll let you guys know. And if there's anything you want to send me, Pleasance, please do. So, and I can forward it to the group or put it on that page. So thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Pleasance. We really
Thank you all
appreciate
so
it.
much. It was great to be with you.
Good to
My
talk.
giraffe says goodbye too.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.